you with us?
Yeah, with you.
Woo! All right, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Just for the sake of the camera, I'm just going to say my name is Jorim Theuns, and this is my thesis presentation. And this is a bit of a crazy circumstances, which is why we're doing it like this. And I wanted to have you guys here because I wanted to have a bit more of a diverse crowd to get more inputs. The presentation is going to be about an idea that have had, and has changed very radically because of COVID. And I'm calling it Broadband Democracy. Just introducing all yourselves. Hello, the jury. Sad that Sanjay couldn't make it, and Camilla, it's way too early for her, so that's kind of sad too. Then the theme. So the theme of this presentation is about random selection, specifically why it's important in science and why it could be important to democracy, and then the twist is why it's extra important now in times of pandemic. Random selection in science has a really long history. 100 years ago, the first randomized control trial was done in medicine. And now, when you get multiple corroborated randomized control trials that are all having the same or similar results, it's considered the gold standard of scientific evidence. The randomized control trials just by themselves are usually placed in second place. Random selection is also an essential part of something called the Monte Carlo method, which is now used in basically every field of science. Whenever you want to probe nonlinear processes or nonlinear dynamics, you usually randomly iterate over the input variables, and it's become crucial in everything from population mapping to computer science. So it's used a lot, but it's not really used in politics, or it kind of is. So random selection as a form of democratic participation has been around for thousands of years, but it's only recently starting to come back into the public sphere. Specifically, the constitution in Iceland, or a constitution in Iceland, was written by a randomly selected citizens panel, but it was rejected by the government. But the new government is taking it much more seriously. So random selection is also being used in the East Cantons in Belgium, where it's actually the first place in the world where it is enshrined in the constitution, where 50% of the parliament is composed of randomly selected citizens that cooperate with the elected officials. The two groups that I'm looking at that are working on this on a kind of structured way are the G1000 group, and they're kind of an advisory board for governments that are interested in random selection, and the Sortition Foundation, which are they're also doing this kind of thing. Yeah, so like, why does it work? If you randomly iterate over the input variables, it allows you to explore complex systems without very much bias. So you can imagine if you were to only select numbers between 1 and 10 for your input variable, then you're going to have a very skewed representation of what the entire system might be able to output. And the larger the sample, so the more randomly selected variables you use, the more detail you can get. But it has diminishing returns. So a sample size of 1,000 is not going to give you twice a better picture than a sample size of 500. The effectiveness of random selection scales non-linearly with sample size and population size. So for a population of, let's say, 64 people, you really need a huge amount of people to be sure that the opinions of the selected group reflect the opinions of the larger group. But when you have larger populations, like for example, the population of a city, let's say 500,000, you would only need 700 samples to have the same certainty that your sample reflects the opinion of the larger group. Obviously, 700 people is still quite a lot, but a smaller group can also be effective if you use supermajorities. So if you have, for example, 200 people, and you say we're only going to pass this law if 95% of this group of 200 agree that it's in their best interests, with a very, very high degree of certainty would be reflected in the will of the greater population. But if you use a simple majority, the power of the test goes down. This is statistics. It's being used in science for decades, and we have a lot of experience with how to do this correctly. The terms I want to start using are things like democratic bandwidth and latency, which kind of go into this digital theme that we'll be exploring later in the presentation. So what are democratic bandwidth? What's democratic latency? Latency is what is the time delay between democratic participation and the democratic participation being reflected in the institution. In the current system that we have, so voting, the latency is quite high. You could say that there is a lot of participation, as in everyone votes, but it's once every 4 years. And while it's a really high sample size, it's a low bandwidth. Actively encouraged participation, so in this case voting, is kind of capped to answering a single question. And higher bandwidth forms of participation like protest, petition, running for office, or working in government are extremely high effort, and so are only really pursued by the people who have the means to be able to pursue them. So maybe now we have dial-up democracy, but what would happen if you had broadband democracy? So what random selection does is it decreases the latency of democratic participation, because the time it takes to set up a randomly selected panel of people is relatively short. You can do it quite quickly, especially with the tools available to, for example, local government. Effectiveness scales non-linearly with sample size, and what that essentially means is that the more people you get diminishing returns. So you don't need very, very large groups in order to establish very high certainty that the group is reflecting the will of the people, you could say. What's really important is that it's unbiased towards effort, wealth, or power, which means that if you're eligible to participate, you have an equal chance to fully participate in the democratic process. The initial idea was to create a documentary that would tell a kind of alternative history of random selection in politics, but this idea kind of fell flat. I started filming and I did a lot of interviews, but obviously with COVID now, it's kind of impossible to do the things that I wanted to do, which relied heavily on candid public participation, going out into the street, interviewing people. Now that that's no longer possible because of COVID, i.e. the challenge, I asked myself if actually COVID could become an opportunity. And I asked myself, how would you do deliberative democracy when everybody's in quarantine? Because obviously now protests aren't possible. Coming together in the town hall is kind of ill-advised. The idea that I had was to make a pandemic-proof digital town hall that uses random selection to assemble citizens' panels for democratic participation and deliberation when traditional forms of high bandwidth participation like protests aren't possible. So a large selection of, for example, the city of Eindhoven, where I live, would be selected, and of the people that are interested, so of the people that use their invitations to kind of sign into this platform, a new subsection is randomly selected to reflect the demographics of the entire population. And the idea of that is to reflect the principles of non-coercion and non-bias representation, which is talked about a lot by the G1000 and by the Sortition Foundation. And what's also really important is that it can't be anonymous. And the reason for that is that you have to have skin in the game. You don't want to have trolls or people that are there to upset the political process. So there needs to be some kind of risk in participation. People use the invitations to register interest in participating in any number of issues, from health and wellness to work or the economy. And randomness is used whenever you need to select issues or match participants or form debates. So whenever any kind of decision making is needed, you use random selection. You let the participants do what they need to do, but whenever there needs to be an algorithm involved, it's done at random. And collaboration with the relevant level of government is also essential to ensure that participants actually feel empowered and listened to, so that it's not some kind of echo chamber of angry citizens, but actually that they feel that they can draft proposals that are then actually taken seriously by government. So yeah, in terms of kind of the graphic design elements, most of the elements such as the fonts and the images would use randomness to some degree to obviously to reflect the main theme. Using randomness as a tool allows for the creation of fractal structures like you see in the presentation, and these structures are what I'm wanting to use to kind of reflect the ideas of the thesis without actually introducing them, so that it doesn't get too narratively complex. It's focused on the tool, and the thesis or the general theory behind it is kind of not hidden but reflected in other elements. My goal for the next couple of months is to make a minimum viable product and a concept page that can serve as a proof of concept in order to generate interest and demand for a digital town hall, both at the government level and at the public level. A working demo would be technically feasible. I have looked into it, but what's more important is that there are concrete design specifications, and it would be amazing if they were backed by organizations such as the Sortition Foundation and by the G1000. I want to use the digital town hall to promote random selection in non-digital forms of participation for when quarantine is no longer necessary. And this can be done by providing links to relevant resources related to sortition. So for example, to the G1000 homepage, or to the Sortition Foundation homepage, or to any number of academic articles that have been written on sortition. And I want to frame this tool as a way to increase the robustness of our democratic institutions when faced with shocks such as COVID-19 and other unknown unknowns like economic recession or the rise of populism or whatever it is. This would kind of be a way to still have high bandwidth participation, high bandwidth democracy that is only dependent on connectivity and not necessarily dependent on all being well. Like it would work during a crisis, or at least that would be a design requirement. So yeah, that's the end of this presentation. And now I'd like to open the floor for questions.
I got one. My only concern is, for example, for elderly people who are especially now completely away from us because they're more of a target group for the virus. How would you make it easy for elderly to access this platform?
Yeah, that's super good. Yeah, the invitations would, and I didn't mention this during the presentation, but that's a really good point. The invitations would be sent out by mail, and they would contain detailed instructions on exactly how to access the platform. But yeah, I didn't actually include that in the presentation. That's really good that you brought that up. Tom, you said you had 4 questions?
Yes. Firstly, you say that random selection is not used in politics with the exception of some recent innovations like Greenland and Belgium. But this overlooks what I think is the main use of random selection in civic life, which is jury service.
Yeah.
And it might be interesting to think about the reasons why people defend random selection for jury service.
Yeah.
So in political theory, we'll call this the epistemic foundations for arguments in favor for jury service.
Mm-hmm.
And there's quite a big debate between people who defend random selection in jury service and people who think that a more important role should be given to judges in criminal law cases,
right,
who have the relevant expertise to make a considered judgment,
yeah,
compared to randomly selected citizens. That literature seems to be quite fundamental to the type of argument that you're making.
Yeah, okay, that's really useful.
Second, you talk about the representativeness of random samples, right? So you need a certain number of people, depending on the size of the total population, to be confident that their views reflect the views of the general population.
Yeah.
One problem, though, is that the defenses of fora like town halls in deliberative democratic theory are often framed around the idea that these fora are supposed to transform people's preferences, right? So compared to ordinary voting mechanisms,
yeah,
deliberative fora are precisely chosen and defended because they enable an interaction between participants such that views on their interests and on what is best, also for the common good, change because of that process.
Yeah.
So this discussion that you have right now in your proposal and in your presentation on the representativeness of random sample seems a little strange, because the whole idea is that this forum enables people to change their mind, right?
Yeah.
So if they were representative on that count, they won't anymore be after the forum.
I would like to answer that question,
Sure.
because I think it's extremely relevant, because I'm trying to ground this in the use of random selection in science, right? So in the scientific community, when you use random selection, for example, when you're probing a complex system, you expect the complex system to transform the input variable. And actually what you're interested in is how the input is transformed. That's what you're looking at. So the input is actually not that important. What's important is how the input is transformed by the mechanism. To put that in the context of democratic deliberation, if we would say that everybody's opinion as of now is a good input into democracy, but that democracy is actually a process to transform people's opinions into policy and into a direction we can all kind of agree on, then what sortition or what random selection in politics is trying to propose is not necessarily that the input is representative of the output, but rather that the input could be anything, could be any number of people, as long as it's randomly selected, but it's looking at how that input is transformed and saying, in effect, that regardless of the input, it would have been transformed in a similar way to arrive at some common output, if that makes sense. So what it's saying is if you have 500 people and they deliberate on a certain topic, and you get another 500 people and they deliberate on a certain topic, it doesn't matter that it's two different groups of 500. What matters is that the deliberation process is completely different in both samples, but that the outcome has a high likelihood of being very similar, if not the same.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, let me just leave that as food for thought. The third question then, you spoke a lot about the desirability of decreasing what you call the latency, so basically the immediacy of democratic decision making.
Mm-hmm.
Have you considered certain theories of democratic representation, like, for example, the trustee model, whereby delegates are given a certain mandate and within that mandate entrusted to gain the relevant expertise and to decide on certain issues that see precisely a kind of slow decision making and the independence of legislators as key criteria of competent legislation?
Yeah, I would like to respond to that as well. What I mean by latency is not necessarily the speed of the process from beginning to end, but what I mean is the speed of the back and forthness. Right now, the back and forthness is that I express my opinion as a voter once every 4 years. Over the course of those 4 years, I get a lot of feedback from kind of my choice, and then in 4 years I can input into the system again. The speed of the decision making is not necessarily a problem, but the latency is more about the speed of the back and forth. Yeah, what is the speed between me as a voter expressing an opinion and getting a response from an institution, and then being able to then re-express a reformulated opinion and then getting another response. If that's done face to face, or if that's done with a small group of people, that would decrease the latency, but that's not necessarily reflective of the length of time that it takes to reach a consensus or a democratic policy.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, you do have the flip side on the part of the decision maker as well, right? Where you have that sort of increased latency, they need to be more responsive, so they need to spend more of their resources, more of their time and energy in communication over other sorts of activities.
Yeah, that's very true. There's more resources in communication.
And the last thing is a big issue with online democratic tools, usually online voting, is security.
Yeah.
Right. So relative to a voting booth where you can show your passport to an official, have your identity verified, and cast your vote. Yeah. There's a lot of insecurity or doubt as to the security of online and other forms of distance voting.
Yeah.
Have you thought about that in the context of your town hall model? Right? How do we ensure that the people who have been selected are in fact the ones that are interacting? A lot of your defense of your model is around its robustness in terms of a different kind of security, right? In terms of the pandemic, these sorts of security issues are not far from our mind.
Yeah. I have thought about it. It is a difficult topic, but I think that one of the requirements of online voting is that it's anonymous, that nobody can trace your vote, but that you can be sure that your vote was counted. That requirement of anonymity is actually what breaks that trust model. But in this kind of sortition town hall model, there is no requirement for anonymity, so identities can be checked whenever they need to be. But you're right in the sense that non-digital participation is obviously far more robust again. The problem is, in a time of pandemic, non-digital is just simply not possible. The question of anonymity is a really game changer when it comes to security. Yeah, voting has to be anonymous again, and this doesn't have to be, so that makes it much easier to make it secure.
I'm not sure if voting has to be anonymous, but other than that, thanks for your reflections.
So I have a few questions as well.
Yeah, awesome.
In science, right, in scientific experiments, we take a lot of effort to ensure that participants are acting individually and aren't influenced or primed by other social influences, unless it's the social influence that's being studied.
Yeah.
So in this digital town hall, how do you ensure that the participants are in fact acting individually? So the idea is that people would get their invitations by mail, but what stops them, what prevents them from essentially creating offline kind of conglomerations or communities that then act through this one person in the digital town hall?
I mean, that's really interesting, and that's really relevant. Off the top of my head, what I would say is that the more off-network connections they build and the more off-network deliberation that there is, the better the system works, actually. What you're asking is, how can we come to some kind of a consensus as a society? If that's the question, if that's kind of like the scientific thing that's being studied, the more people that are involved and the more they are involved with each other, the more interesting the outcome would be. Because the more inputs you get as a participant, the more information you have to process, the more deliberation you go through privately, only adds to the quality of the deliberation when it comes to the digital town hall. So I don't think that would be an issue.
And also, so about the randomization procedure itself, are you thinking of a sort of stratified randomization, or is it purely random? And if it is truly random, then going back to the comment about the elderly, how do you ensure that there is an equal participation from them? Yeah,
it's done in two stages. So you have the first stage where the invitations are sent out, and this is done completely at random because you have a very, very large sample size. In order to ensure that you can do stratified sampling of the subset of people that are interested, you need to have a very large number of invitations, which means that purely random works really well. But when the people that are interested register and sign up, then you do a stratified sample that reflects the demographics of the group as a whole. It does introduce error, right? It introduces bias, and that's something that you just can't avoid.
How directly are these interactions that are happening in the digital town hall influencing what comes out of it? Are they acting as potential legislators, or are they acting as advisors to legislate?
Exactly the same question, so I've written it down.
What I'm doing with regards to these kinds of questions, I'm going to be falling back on the experience of the G1000 and the Sortition Foundation, because they actually have experience in doing this kind of thing. And what they both say is that there has to be some kind of legally binding power for the people to actually feel the responsibility and to deliberate effectively. So the way that it's done in France, as Tom has noted, where it's done consultatively, I think that's an important first step, but I don't think it's where this should be going. I want to look more at how, for example, it's done in the East Cantons of Belgium. As for how participants arrive at legislation, that's something that I don't have any experience with, but that the G1000 and the Sortition Foundation are doing a lot of work on how to make legislation citizen friendly, and that's a really crucial point. So that's something I'll be spending a lot of time on.
If you consider all the questions that you've gotten so far, I think they are more related to the population and random selection.
Yeah.
It's less than the minimum viable product that you want to build throughout this process.
All of those things that we're talking about now, the more political side of things is far more interesting to me as well than the technical side of actually getting it off the ground. When I say creating a concept page and generating interest, what I mean is generating debate, is just finding more people that disagree with me and trying to figure out why they disagree and how the thing can be twisted to fit their input.
How have you done this very specific political technological project that relates to COVID-19 and been doing it for weeks?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been doing my thesis for months now, and it's been on random selection in politics, but it's been just without the context of COVID. So I needed to really radically change the whole design project, which is why I'm doing this instead.
Which is also much cooler, I find. And also because I think that in this period, a lot more people, at least in my experience, have been asking themselves how they can get more involved or what they can actually do and participate into kind of recreating a society when all of this washes over or whatnot. So I think it's relevant and nicely thought of, like in the whole context.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay then. Awesome. Thank you guys so much for participating. All right. Thank you so much. And stay healthy and stay happy. Much love.